The Ardennes lay buried beneath a suffocating blanket of snow. In mid-December 1944, the forests of Belgium were silent except for the low rumble of German engines crawling through the mist. The men of the US Army huddled in foxholes, their breath frozen on the rims of their helmets, unaware that an entire German army was already moving toward them. For the first time in months, the Luftwaffe's banners stirred once more, and overcast skies held their silent favor. The weather had locked the skies in ice and blindness. Snow fell so thick that even the sound of aircraft was smothered. Allied pilots, those same men who had ruled Europe's air for over a year, stood helpless beside their grounded planes. At forward airfields in France and Belgium, rows of P-47 Thunderbolts and P-51 Mustangs sat frozen under sheets of rime. Their engines refused to turn over, oil congealed in the lines, fuel thickened in the tanks. The world above had vanished behind a curtain of fog and snow, and in that absence, Hitler made his move. On the ground, the thunder came from the east. Before dawn on December 16th, German artillery shattered the stillness of the Ardennes. The barrage rolled across the valleys like distant thunder, and for a brief moment, the men on the front believed it was weather, just another storm moving in from the north. Then the shells began to fall. Under cover of the blizzard, 3 German armies surged forward, veterans, young recruits, even men pulled from the ruins of shattered divisions. Tanks ground their way through the woods, their treads muffled by snow. Infantry followed, ghosts in white camouflage. For the first time since D-Day, the Germans were on the offensive, driving a wedge into the Allied line with terrifying precision. At the Allied airfields, frustration mixed with disbelief. The airmen could hear the distant guns, but could do nothing. Commanders cursed the weather reports. Pilots paced in their heavy coats, scanning a sky that refused to open. The ground crews shoveled snow away from the runways every few hours, only for it to return, thicker than before. The entire might of the US Army Air Forces, the weapon that had shattered cities, crippled industries, and broken the Luftwaffe, was frozen in place by a grey and pitiless winter. In briefing tents, maps were spread and targets circled, but the missions were theoretical ghosts. Orders came through from higher command: stand by. Those 2 words hung in the air like frost. Every pilot knew that men were dying on the ground while they waited for the weather to break. The 101st Airborne was surrounded near Bastogne. Roads were collapsing under German armor, and without air support, entire divisions risked being cut off. At Florennes Airfield, Captain John Howell of the 354 Fighter Group wrote in his logbook, "Visibility nil, snow heavy, engines frozen, can hear the front, can't reach it." He had flown nearly 80 missions in 1944, escorting bombers into Germany, strafing trains across Hommes, France. Yet now, in the most desperate days of the war, his machine was useless, a caged predator in the snow. The Luftwaffe too found itself limited by the same blizzard. German pilots sat in their cockpits and listened to the wind howl across frozen runways. The Jagdgeschwader commanders wanted to take advantage of the fog to strike Allied airfields and supply columns while the enemy was blind, but even their aircraft, short on fuel, starved of parts, struggled to start. The difference was that for once, the Germans didn't need the sky. They had the ground. In the towns of Saint-Vith, Bastogne and Malmedy, American soldiers fought in isolation. Tanks ran out of ammunition, radios crackled with broken pleas for air cover that never came. Pilots listening on secondary channels clenched their fists in helpless anger. The air war that had once shaped every battle in Europe had been erased by clouds. From London to Paris, Allied intelligence tried to decipher Hitler's intentions. Few had believed he could still mount an attack of this scale, yet the pattern became undeniable. Columns of German vehicles were reported moving through the forests, and reconnaissance from earlier in the month now took on grim clarity. It was a counter-offensive, one final gamble to split the Allied armies and retake Antwerp, and so the Allied airmen waited. Snow buried everything. At Saint-Dizier, ground crews chopped through ice that encased their P-47s like sarcophagi. At Juvincourt, men used blowtorches to warm the engine blocks of their Mustangs, only for the effort to be undone by another night of freezing fog. The air smelled of kerosene and despair. Even the bombers, those vast engines of destruction, sat silent in their dispersal points, their wings glazed in white. For 6 days, the battle raged without the sky's involvement. The Germans advanced through the forest, their panzer divisions cutting through Allied lines with grim determination. Villages were captured and retaken in hours. the roads clogged with wreckage and the frozen bodies of men and machines. Without the eyes of the Air Force, Allied commanders struggled to piece together what was happening. Maps changed by the hour. Reports contradicted each other. The fog of war was literal now, thick enough to erase entire regiments. Yet above it all, the airmen remained poised, waiting, ready, engines fueled, weapons loaded, every man aware that when the weather finally cleared, they would have to make up for lost time. There was an edge in their voices, an understanding that when the order came, it would be more than a mission. It would be vengeance for the week spent grounded, vengeance for the soldiers freezing in the forests of the Ardennes. On the night of December 22nd, a faint wind swept through the cloud layer. For the first time in a week, stars flickered through the haze above the runways. Pilots emerging from their tents stopped and stared, breath fogging in the cold air. Somewhere beyond those clouds, dawn was waiting. In the early hours of December the 23rd, weather officers confirmed the miracle. Clear skies moving in from the west. Radios crackled with a single electric message, airfields green. Prepare to scramble. At every base across France and Belgium, the mood changed instantly. Men leapt from their bunks, mechanics sprinted for the hangars, and the stillness of the past week shattered into motion. The storm had finally broken. Engines coughed, then roared to life. Propellers spun through the mist, cutting through the last wisps of fog. From the flight lines to the control towers, an unspoken understanding passed between every man. The sky was open again, and with it came the chance to strike back. The Luftwaffe's brief reprieve was over. Above the Ardennes, the balance of power was about to shift once more. Tomorrow, the air would burn. ChatGPT said, Chapter 2, the sky breaks open. The morning of December 23rd, 1944, arrived like a revelation. The storm that had cloaked Europe for a week was gone, swept away by a cold front that rolled eastward over France. For the first time in days, the grey ceiling lifted. The pale light of dawn spilled across the frozen runways of Allied airfields, painting the parked aircraft in a thin metallic sheen. Engines that had slept under tarps now stood uncovered, their cowls glinting in the brittle sunlight. The air was sharp and clean, laced with the tang of fuel and thawing frost. At the 366th Fighter Group's field near Asch, Belgium, the first weather report came in before sunrise. Visibility 10 miles, cloud cover 0%. The news spread through the tents like electricity. Men who had spent a week pacing through the mud now bolted into action. Mechanics ran from plane to plane, tugging away canvas covers, checking lines, testing hydraulics. Ground crews shouted orders over the roar of warming engines. Across Europe, hundreds of similar scenes played out as airfields from England to France erupted into life. The waiting was over. For days, Allied pilots had listened helplessly to radio calls from the front. Reports of German tanks surrounding Bastogne, of convoys cut to ribbons on the roads, of paratroopers holding out in the snow. Now the clear skies promised redemption. Pilots and navigators gathered around maps spread across mess tables, tracing routes with gloved fingers. Every town name, Houffalize, Saint-Vith, Clairvaux, carried weight. These were the places where men on the ground were fighting and freezing, waiting for the thunder of engines overhead. At 0800 hours, the first flight orders came through. Fighter bombers of the 9th Air Force were to strike German armour pushing west along the roads near Bastogne and Saint-Vith. The 8th Air Force, with its bomber stream still grounded in England, prepared to follow as soon as the runways there were cleared of snow. Above them, the fighter groups of the 352nd, 361st and 354th Mustangs and Thunderbolts would sweep ahead, clearing the sky of whatever the Luftwaffe still dared to send up. Captain John Howell, who had watched helplessly through the blizzard, climbed into the cockpit of his P-51 Southern Belle and flipped the ignition switches. The engine coughed once, then roared into life. The vibration shuddered through the airframe, familiar and alive. Across the line, other aircraft came alive in unison, an entire orchestra of power shaking off the paralysis of winter. The control tower's signal lamp flashed green. One by one, the Mustangs began to roll, wheels crunching through the slush. The first squadron took off in pairs, their wings slicing through the morning haze as they climbed eastward. Trails of exhaust stretched behind them like ribbons. Within minutes, the airfield was empty except for the fading echo of engines. As the fighters gained altitude, the landscape unfolded beneath them. The forests of the Ardennes spread out like a dark sea, the trees weighed down by snow. Thin roads wound through the white wilderness, marked by tiny columns of smoke where tanks and trucks crawled forward. The radio chatter came alive with target reports and contact calls. The Luftwaffe was airborne again. Near the German border, reconnaissance flights had already spotted the first enemy formations climbing to meet them. Bf-109S and FW-190S, painted in mottled grey and green, streaked across the horizon. They rose from hidden airfields in western Germany, bases that had lain dormant through the storms. Now, with the weather cleared, the Luftwaffe was taking its chance to strike back. The first contact came just before 0900 hours over the town of Prüm. A group of Mustangs from the 352nd Fighter Group spotted movement in the cloud banks to the northeast. Bandits, 11 o'clock high, came the call over the radio. The formation tightened instantly. The lead pilot banked hard left, the rest following in perfect precision. Seconds later, the sky erupted. Contrails crossed in long white arcs as both sides dove to attack. The Mustangs met the Messerschmitts head-on, their guns flashing in the morning light. The air filled with the crack of machine guns and the dull thud of cannon fire. In the chaos, one P-51 rolled sharply and dove after a fleeing 109, the two machines twisting through the air like dancers locked in mortal rhythm. At treetop level, the German pilot pulled hard into a climb, but the Mustang's 6.50 caliber guns found him first. The Messerschmitt disintegrated in a burst of smoke and flame, pieces spinning down into the forest below. Over the radio came the terse report. One confirmed. Continue to Bastogne. Farther south, Thunderbolt squadrons of the 9th Air Force roared low over the snowfields. Their task was brutal and clear. Find the armoured columns and destroy them. The P-47s, heavier and more rugged than the sleek Mustangs, carried bombs under their wings. Flying in pairs, they swept along the roads leading to Bastogne, where German panzer divisions were advancing under the cover of the morning haze. From above, the roads looked like thin black veins crawling through white skin. Trucks, half-tracks, and tanks filled every inch of space. The first Thunderbolt group broke formation, diving from 5,000 feet. Bombs tumbled away in perfect sequence, the shockwaves lifting snow into glittering clouds. In seconds, the road was a twisting inferno. Ammunition trucks exploded, sending fireballs skyward that rolled like miniature suns. The Luftwaffe struck back with whatever fighters they could muster. Small groups of FW-19s darted among the valleys, trying to catch the Thunderbolts as they pulled up from their dives. The dogfights that followed were fierce and fleeting. Short, vicious exchanges where a mistake meant death. The German pilots fought with desperate precision, many of them veterans of the Eastern Front. They had the advantage of terrain and experience, but they were outnumbered 10-1. By noon, the entire Ardennes sky was alive with movement. Trails of vapor wove across the horizon. Gunfire flickered between the clouds, and below, the ground battle shifted. American troops trapped in Bastogne looked up from their foxholes and saw sunlight glinting off wings. The sound was like salvation. "The Air Corps is here," one paratrooper shouted. For the first time in days, supply drops began to reach the town. Gliders and C-47s braved the flak to release bundles of ammunition and food, escorted by fighters that scoured the skies above. The turning point of the day came in the early afternoon. Allied radar detected a large concentration of enemy aircraft forming over Bonn. It was a final attempt by the Luftwaffe to break through and disrupt the Allied counteroffensive. Over 200 German fighters surged toward the front, diving into the chaos above the Ardennes. The response was immediate. Mustangs and Thunderbolts scrambled to intercept. What followed was one of the largest air battles of the Western Front. The sky above the snow-covered forest turned into a storm of motion, engines roaring, tracers arcing, explosions echoing between the clouds. For every German fighter that broke through, 5 Allied aircraft hunted it down. Pilots fought until their ammunition was gone, then rammed their throttles forward and fled back to base, fuel gauges nearly empty. As the sun dipped low over the horizon, the skies began to clear of smoke. The surviving German formations retreated eastward, their losses staggering. The Allies had claimed more than 100 enemy aircraft destroyed by the end of the day. The Luftwaffe had gambled on the weather and lost. Back at Asch and St. Trond, the returning pilots taxied to their hard stands as the light faded. Ground crews surrounded them with cheers and questions. Frost formed again on the wings as the temperature dropped, but the spirits of the men had lifted for the first time in weeks. The fog was gone, the enemy beaten from the air, and tomorrow's missions were already being drawn up. In the officers' mess, the chatter was subdued. They spoke of near misses, of comrades who didn't come back, and of the eerie sight of German columns burning below the snow. The day had been a turning point, though none of them would call it victory yet. They all knew the war had one more desperate twist to come. Somewhere east of the Rhine, German commanders were already planning their next move, one final strike that would come with the dawn of the new year. The snow in Bastogne had turned to ash. By the third week of December, the once peaceful town was a fortress under siege. Its streets choked with wrecked vehicles, its defenders half frozen, their breath misting in the air like smoke from dying fires. The 101st Airborne and elements of the 10th Armoured Division were trapped within the encirclement, their lifelines severed, their supplies dwindling to nothing. From above, the town appeared as a smudge of blackened ruin amid endless white fields. Yet on the morning of December 23rd, as the Allied air forces surged back into the sky, that little town became the center of everything. At first light, the American lines were quiet, except for the dull thud of artillery. The men in the trenches peered upward at a sky they had prayed for all week, clear, pale blue, swept clean by the wind. Sergeant David Cox of the 327th Glider Infantry wrote later that the silence before the engines came was worse than any shelling. Then came the sound, a distant hum that built into a thunderous roar. The air was alive again. From the west, the first C-47 transport planes appeared, silver specks glinting against the morning sun. Their formation stretched for miles, a river of wings pouring towards the town. Paratroopers below broke into cheers, some climbing onto the frozen hoods of jeeps to wave their helmets in the air. The long-awaited resupply mission was underway. At 10,000 feet, the C-47s opened their bellies. Crates tumbled through the air, parachutes blooming like flowers over the snow. Ammunition, food, bandages, even Christmas rations fell through the silence. The pilots flew straight through the arcs of German flak to make sure the drops landed inside the perimeter, and above them, circling protectively, the P-47 Thunderbolts and P-51 Mustangs of the 9th and 8th Air Forces prowled like wolves guarding their pack. The first German response came swiftly. Jagdgeschwader 11, one of the few Luftwaffe wings still operational in the region, scrambled a flight of Focke-Wulf 190s from a snowbound strip near Bonn. Their orders were to break through the American fighter screen and destroy the transport planes. Low on fuel, short on ammunition, the German pilots flew into the Ardennes with grim precision, streaking across the treetops to stay hidden from radar. The Allied patrols spotted them at 9:27 a.m. A group of Mustangs from the 352nd Fighter Group intercepted the 19s just north of Bastogne. Captain Bill Wisner, a veteran of nearly 100 combat missions, was leading the flight. His voice crackled across the radio. "Tally-ho, 12 bandits, Angels 5 coming in hot." The engagement that followed unfolded in seconds. The Mustangs turned into the attack, engines howling, wings slicing through the sky. The first pass was a blur of tracers. A German fighter exploded in a burst of orange, spiraling down through the mist. Another 190 pulled into a climb, only to have Wisner on his tail, firing in controlled bursts until the cockpit erupted in flame. The two aircraft crossed so close that Wisner could see the pilot's scarf fluttering in the wind. Below, the paratroopers of Bastogne watched the dogfights unfold above them, tiny silver and grey specks twisting and diving against the pale backdrop of the morning sky. The sounds of battle came in echoes, sharp and distant, like thunder in a faraway storm. The air above the Ardennes was chaos. Dozens of Allied fighters tangled with the German interceptors, each duel an isolated storm within the greater tempest. The Luftwaffe pilots, experienced but exhausted, fought with remarkable courage, yet the weight of numbers was crushing. Every minute, more Mustangs joined the fight, diving in from the west to block any path towards the transports. Meanwhile, the Thunderbolts went to work on the ground. Flying low, sometimes below treetop height, they followed the trails of German armour moving toward Bastogne. The enemy convoys had been pushing hard all night, their tanks grinding through the snow, desperate to crush the American pocket before the weather turned again. Now they faced an unrelenting assault from above. At 500 feet, Major Ben Collins of the 365 Fighter Group led his squadron into the valley east of Nefer. Through the canopy, he could see the columns of German tanks moving like dark scars across the white fields. "Pick your target and stay steady," he told his men. The Thunderbolts dived together, bombs whistling through the frozen air. The first explosions threw geysers of snow and debris into the sky. Tanks slewed sideways, tracks torn apart, trucks carrying ammunition ignited, their flames reflecting off the armor of those still moving. As Collins pulled up, machine gun fire from the surviving vehicles streaked past his wings. He swung his P-47 around and dropped into another attack run, this time firing his 8.50 caliber guns into the column's rear. The rounds tore through half-tracks and personnel carriers, scattering soldiers into the ditches. By the time he climbed back to 3,000 feet, the valley below was a graveyard of metal. Over the radio, the airwaves buzzed with triumph and tension. Pilots called out targets, locations, and desperate warnings as new enemy fighters entered the battle. The Luftwaffe was throwing in everything it had. Messerschmitts from JG2 and 26, Focke-Wulfs from scattered airfields along the Rhine. The sky filled with contrails and smoke, each streak marking another contest for survival. By midday, the Germans shifted tactics. Rather than attacking the transports, they turned on the Thunderbolts that had mauled their ground forces. The 190s dived out of the sun, catching one P-47 formation by surprise. 2 American planes were hit within seconds, plunging into the forest below. The rest broke formation and fought back fiercely. The air became a twisting carousel of violence, aircraft crossing paths so closely that pilots could smell the burning oil. At 12:40 p.m, another Allied squadron entered the fray, P-51s from the 361st Group flying in from the west. Their leader, Major Urban Drew, called for a high split to cut off the German escape route. Diving from 18,000 feet, the Mustangs fell upon the Luftwaffe like hawks. Within 10 minutes, the tide turned again. The German formation broke apart under the pressure, each surviving pilot fleeing eastward, low and fast, hoping to reach the safety of the Rhine. The air over Bastogne quieted by early afternoon. Smoke trailed across the horizon where the battles had raged. The ground below was littered with the wrecks of German vehicles. The forests burned where bombs had fallen. The transport planes had completed their mission. Hundreds of tons of supplies now lay in Allied hands. For the men on the ground, it meant another day of life. For the airmen, it meant the battle was far from over. As the fighters regrouped and turned for home, the radio net filled with after-action chatter. Call signs were checked, numbers tallied. A few voices were missing. Men who had vanished into the cloud banks, whose parachutes might still be descending somewhere in the snow. Yet for all the losses, the victory was undeniable. Bastogne still stood, and the Luftwaffe had failed to break the line. When the pilots returned to their airfields, the sun was already sinking behind the Ardennes. The golden light caught the frost on their wings, making the aircraft shimmer as they taxied to a stop. Ground crews waved them in, some smiling, others silent, eyes fixed on the empty spots where certain planes should have been. That evening, the mess halls were alive with subdued conversation. The men spoke of the day's chaos, of narrow escapes, of comrades lost and victories won. Outside, the air was still cold, but the fog had not returned. The night sky was full of stars, an omen perhaps that the weather would hold a little longer. For the first time in a week, the men of Bastogne could sleep without the constant fear of encirclement. Above them, the contrails of their protectors still lingered faintly in the upper air, frozen threads of salvation. The day's battle had proven that the skies once again belonged to the Allies. Yet in the German hangars farther east, new orders were already being drawn up. Plans were forming for a massive counterstrike, a final gamble to reclaim the air. The next dawn would bring with it another reckoning. The morning after the resupply of Bastogne, the air over the Ardennes looked deceptively peaceful. Thin ribbons of mist drifted between the treetops, curling through the valleys where tanks smouldered beneath their blankets of frost. The storm clouds that had ruled the region for a week were gone now, but a new kind of storm was gathering, one made of engines, gunfire, and willpower. High above the frozen earth, thousands of men climbed into the frigid blue, each knowing that by sundown many would not return. At first light on December 24th, the runways across Belgium and northern France glowed amber in the rising sun. Frosted propellers glimmered as ground crews worked through the chill, refueling Mustangs and Thunderbolts that had barely cooled from the day before. The men moved with purpose, every motion rehearsed, every sound deliberate. The mood had changed since the long days of waiting in the fog. Now the tempo was relentless. The air war had reignited, and the Luftwaffe was showing its teeth again. Intelligence officers briefed the pilots inside tents lit by dim lanterns. Reports from overnight reconnaissance had confirmed large-scale Luftwaffe movement, fighter wings redeploying east of the Rhine, staging for renewed attacks. Commanders believed the Germans were concentrating to strike Allied supply lines behind Bastogne. The mission was simple in words, deadly in execution. Intercept, engage, and destroy any enemy aircraft above the snow line. By 0900 hours, the sky was a patchwork of contrails. Groups of P-51 Mustangs from the 352nd and 356th Fighter Groups rose from their bases in France, climbing into the upper atmosphere in loose formations. Each man adjusted his oxygen mask, checked his guns, and scanned the horizon where the world turned to white haze. From that height, the Ardennes looked peaceful, almost unreal, an endless blanket of snow punctuated by the scars of battle. Yet beneath the illusion of calm, thousands of soldiers fought, bled, and froze. Lieutenant Robert "Mac" McCall, leading Blue Flight, squinted into the glare. His Mustang, Lucky Lady, hummed smoothly at 25,000 feet. "Keep your eyes open," he said through the radio. "They're up here somewhere." The voice that came back crackled with static. "Copy that, boss." Feels like the quiet before the hammer. Minutes later, radar stations near Liège picked up the hammer's fall. A massive German formation, over 100 aircraft, was climbing westward from Bonn and Cologne. It was the largest Luftwaffe concentration seen since Big Week months earlier. Their orders were clear: engage the Allied escorts, clear the air for bombers and ground attack units, and strike back at the heart of the offensive. The two forces converged just after 10:15 a.m. The first contact came over the River Our, where the cloud banks formed shifting walls of vapor. Through that ghostly landscape, shapes began to emerge, dark silhouettes slicing through the mist. Messerschmitt Bf-109s led the charge, followed by squadrons of Focke-Wulf 190s flying close behind, their radial engines leaving black streaks across the sky. McCall's voice came over the radio again, calm and sharp. "Bandits high, 1 o'clock. Break formation. We go hunting." The Mustangs peeled away in pairs, diving into the fog. The serene blue world above vanished in an instant, replaced by chaos and sound. The roar of engines bounced off the cloud walls, disorienting even seasoned pilots. Visibility dropped to a few hundred feet. Every turn risked a collision. Every shadow could be a friend or an enemy. Out of the whiteness, a 109 shot past, cannon flashing. McCall's wingman shouted a warning, rolled left and countered. The Mustang twisted through the vapor, tracers streaking behind it. The German banked hard to escape, only to run headlong into another Allied pair emerging from the fog. The air filled with debris and smoke. The cloud banks became a labyrinth of death. Combat broke into fragments. Brief feral encounters scattered across miles of sky. Pilots fought by instinct and reflex. One moment, silence. The next, the world erupted in color and sound. Machine guns crackled. Spent shells clattered against fuselages. Vapor trails folded into one another like ribbons in the wind. Captain Harold "Hawk" Linton led his Mustang flight through the densest part of the formation. He could see muzzle flashes in every direction, tiny bursts of orange within the grey. Pulling back on the stick, he climbed above the fight, watching for the telltale movement of enemy fighters diving to attack. Two Focke-Wulfs streaked beneath him, chasing an American P-47 caught low. Linton rolled inverted, dropped into a near-vertical dive, and opened fire. His tracers found the trailing 190, shredding its tail. The second German broke away, but not fast enough. Linton's wingman finished the job, and the fighter fell through the clouds, trailing black smoke. Farther west, another Mustang group was in trouble. They had chased a flight of Messerschmitts too deep into the fog, losing cohesion. When they emerged on the far side, they were outnumbered. The Germans, flying lower and faster, pressed their advantage. What followed was one of the most ferocious air duels of the campaign. Over the forest near Wiltz, 15 Allied fighters and nearly twice that number of Luftwaffe aircraft collided in a swirling melee. The fight stretched from the treetops to 30,000 feet. Pilots looped and rolled through the clouds, firing when they caught even a glimpse of their enemy. The sky itself seemed alive, an endless shifting canvas of vapor cut by the flashes of battle. Several aircraft collided mid-air, their flaming wrecks spiraling downward together. Others simply vanished into the mist, unseen until they exploded against the frozen ground below. By noon, the fight had drifted southward toward Clairvaux. The radio was alive with overlapping voices, calls for help, confirmations of kills, cries of loss. Through it all, squadron leaders tried to keep order, directing flights toward the densest clusters of enemy fighters. One of those leaders, Major James Goodson, later described it as flying through a dream of fire and snow. The turning point came when the weather itself shifted. A wind from the west began to scatter the clouds, breaking them into long trailing veils. Suddenly, the vastness of the sky opened up, and for the first time, both sides saw the full scope of the battle. Hundreds of contrails arced and twisted across the air like scars. The Germans, realizing their advantage in cover was gone, began to pull back. The Allied pilots, now with clear visibility, pounced on the retreating formations. McCall's squadron dove from 22,000 feet, catching a group of 1-9s that had broken formation. One by one, the German fighters fell. The remaining Luftwaffe pilots, low on fuel, disengaged and turned east. The pursuit lasted less than 10 minutes, but by the time the Mustangs reformed, the horizon was empty. The battle above the cloud banks had lasted barely 2 hours, yet its effects would ripple across the front for weeks. Allied reports confirmed over 130 German aircraft destroyed or lost, many of them with veteran pilots who could not be replaced. The Americans had suffered too, dozens of aircraft gone and many of their best men missing, but the skies belonged to them once more. As the Mustangs returned to base, the afternoon sun turned the clouds gold. The airfields buzzed with relief and exhaustion. Mechanics ran to meet the returning fighters, counting the planes as they came in. For every one that landed, another was missing. Some returned riddled with holes, their wings patched with frost and blood. That evening, the pilots gathered in silence around a stove in the officers' tent. No one spoke for a long time. Outside, the wind carried the faint scent of oil and smoke. The day had been a victory, though it felt hollow. They all knew the Luftwaffe was far from finished. Somewhere beyond the Rhine, new orders were being drafted. In just over a week, on New Year's morning, the Germans would gamble everything in one last desperate act. The world would come to call it Operation Bodenplatte. The road to St. Vith wound like a black scar through the snowbound valleys of the Ardennes. For days it had served as a lifeline for the German offensive, tanks, half-tracks and artillery creeping through the forests toward the front. When the weather cleared and the Luftwaffe was thrown back on its heels, that road became a target. The order went out to the 9th Air Force: cut the artery, whatever the cost. By dawn on December 25th, the pilots of the 365th Fighter Group gathered around a map spread across Iki-Iki-Iki, a Jeep hood. Their aircraft, P-47 Thunderbolts, heavy and bruised from constant use, waited on the icy strip behind them. The briefing was blunt. Intelligence from reconnaissance flights showed a column of armor moving east of Saint-Vith, attempting to break through to support the forces surrounding Bastogne. It was the largest concentration of German vehicles seen since the offensive began. The mission was simple in theory, perilous in practice: destroy the column, choke the advance, and give the troops on the ground a moment to breathe. Major Frank Red James, a tall, hawk-faced veteran of Normandy, led the operation. He studied the photos of the target, a serpentine convoy threading through wooded hills, flanked by pines so dense that visibility from the air would be fleeting. Flak guns were scattered along the ridges, disguised in snow. He looked up at his men, most barely 20 years old. "Once we hit the line, there's no time for second passes," he said. "Make every round count." Engines began to rumble before sunrise. The Thunderbolts lumbered down the frozen runway one after another, their radial engines spitting blue fire. The air vibrated with the sound of raw power as they lifted into the grey morning. Frosted treetops blurred beneath their wings. Each pilot flew low, no higher than a few hundred feet, using the terrain itself as cover. In the cockpits, the radio chatter was clipped and calm, altitudes, bearings, call signs, an orchestra of routine masking the tension that knotted in every stomach. 20 minutes into the flight, the clouds broke, revealing the whitened world below. The sun rose pale and weak, its light glancing off the snow. The pilots followed the Meuse River eastward, its frozen bends glinting like glass. Ahead lay St. Vith, a cluster of ruins barely visible through the haze of smoke that marked the front line. Beyond it stretched the valley, the route of the German thrust. At 9:47, the first glimpse came through the mist. Tracks carved through the snow, hundreds of them weaving between the hills. Major James's voice came over the radio. "There she is, boys. Line up for the run." The formation split into 2 flights. 8 Thunderbolts climbed slightly, then rolled into a shallow dive. The rest remained low to cover them. The first bombs fell seconds later, 500-pounders tumbling end over end before erupting along the column's head. The explosions tore open the road in fountains of mud and smoke. Tanks jackknifed, trucks flipped into ditches, and the entire convoy shuddered to a halt. Anti-aircraft fire answered immediately. Orange blossoms of flak burst across the valley, each explosion leaving black scars against the pale sky. The Americans pressed on through it, engines howling, wings trembling. From his cockpit, Lieutenant Mason Rourke saw the bursts ahead and felt the jolt of fear in his chest, the primal instinct to climb away. He forced it down and dove instead, releasing his pair of bombs directly into the densest cluster of vehicles. The shockwave struck his aircraft like a physical blow, the cockpit rattling as fragments of metal clanged off the fuselage. When he pulled up, half the road was burning. German soldiers scattered in every direction, some firing machine guns futilely at the streaking Thunderbolts. The air stank of oil and smoke. Over the radio, Rourke heard a voice laughing, a wild, disbelieving sound, someone exclaiming that they'd hit fuel trucks and the entire horizon was on fire. Flames leapt 30 feet high, twisting in the wind. The heat reached the cockpits as the planes roared past. The second wave arrived moments later. Flying barely 100 feet above the treetops, they strafed the survivors. Streams of 50 caliber rounds carved lines through the snow, shredding whatever moved. A Panther tank tried to pivot its turret towards the noise, only for armor-piercing bullets to punch through its engine deck. The machine stopped dead, smoke coiling from its rear vents. Another Thunderbolt swooped in behind it and dropped a 250-pound bomb squarely into the center of the road, splitting the vehicle in 2. For 15 minutes, the attack was relentless. Each flight rolled in, fired, and climbed away to reform, the timing so precise it looked choreographed. Puffed. From above, the valley had transformed into a boiling scar of fire and debris. Columns of black smoke rose through the snowfall, drifting east with the wind. Radio reports confirmed over 60 vehicles destroyed within the first runs. Then the flak grew heavier. The German gunners had recovered, bringing their 20mm cannons to bear. Shrapnel tore through the air, glittering like shards of ice. One Thunderbolt took a direct hit under the left wing. Flames trailed instantly. The pilot, Lieutenant Ken Bray, jettisoned his canopy and bailed out, parachute blooming in the smoke as his aircraft spun earthward. His squadron saw him land in the trees, alive, waving once before vanishing beneath the canopy. There was no time to mark the spot. The final assault came from the lowest altitude yet. Major James led 4 Thunderbolts straight through the valley, almost skimming the treetops. The roar of their engines shook the snow from the branches. They opened fire together, raking the wreckage until ammunition counters ticked to 0. Each burst sent sparks and fragments flying into the air. Then they climbed away in unison, the valley receding beneath them, a corridor of ruins stretching as far as the eye could see. By the time the group regrouped over the rendezvous point, the valley below was obscured by smoke. Fires burned unchecked, fueled by fuel tanks and ammunition still exploding in chain reactions. The road to St. Vith was gone, replaced by a ribbon of molten earth and shattered armor. As they headed home, the radio was filled with reports from ground observers. The German column annihilated, the advance halted. What the Thunderbolts had accomplished in less than an hour would take enemy engineers days to repair. For the men of the 365th, the mission was a grim satisfaction. One clear strike amid the chaos of the Ardennes. Back at base, the exhausted pilots stepped down onto the tarmac, faces streaked with sweat and soot despite the cold. Mechanics swarmed their planes, counting the holes punched through the metal, patching them before the next sortie. When the numbers came in, the scope of the destruction stunned even headquarters. Over 150 enemy vehicles destroyed or abandoned. The Luftwaffe had attempted to intercept during the attack, but Allied fighters farther north kept them occupied, preventing interference. The victory belonged entirely to the Thunderbolts. That evening, Major James stood outside the operations tent, watching the horizon fade into crimson. The fires from St. Vith were visible even from here, a dull glow on the edge of the world. Snowflakes drifted through the smoke, glowing briefly as they caught the light before vanishing. The battle for the Ardennes still raged, but for the first time the front had stopped moving westward. In the distance, the low rumble of engines rolled through the air. Somewhere beyond that glow, the Luftwaffe was mustering its remaining strength. The Allied flyers knew this reprieve would not last. The next confrontation would come soon, and it would be larger than anything since the invasion of Normandy. The following days would see the sky itself turned into a battlefield of reckoning, a last desperate gamble from an air force on the brink. The sun over the Ardennes hung low and cold, bleeding pale light through a haze that clung to the frozen fields. December the 26th began quietly, the kind of silence that soldiers learned to fear. Across Belgium and Western Germany, the remnants of the Luftwaffe prepared for what their commanders were calling eine letzte Anstrengung, one last effort. Inside the cracked hangars of Luftwaffe bases from Bonn to Koblenz, mechanics worked through the icy dawn, hands numb on metal tools. The air smelled of oil, frost, and desperation. Fuel was scarce, so scarce that every drop had been siphoned from grounded bombers and training aircraft to fill the tanks of the fighters still capable of flight. Old hands stood beside young men barely out of flight school, fastening ammunition belts, adjusting engines, muttering silent prayers. There was no illusion among them. Each knew this day was borrowed time. The orders were clear. Launch a massed strike across the Western Front. Break the momentum of the American air campaign. Burn their airfields, cripple their logistics, shatter their belief in air supremacy. For the first time since 1940, the Luftwaffe would commit nearly all it had left to a single, coordinated blow. By mid-morning, the radio squawked with clipped commands. Engines coughed into life, echoing across the frozen plains. One after another, the fighters rolled down their cracked runways. Messerschmitts, Focke-Wulfs, and even a handful of the revolutionary jet-powered Me-262s. Their exhaust plumes shimmered in the cold air, leaving trails of grey smoke against the snow. Wing after wing rose into the pale sky, each pilot following the same compass bearing, west. The Allies spotted the build-up almost immediately. Radar operators in Belgium began reporting dozens, then hundreds of contacts forming over the Rhine. Alarms rang through the airfields at Asch, Saint-Trond, and Florennes. Pilots sprinted across icy tarmac, flight helmets in hand, mechanics scrambling to pull away chocks as engines roared awake. The air controllers shouted into their radios, voices steady despite the rising tension. Scramble all available squadrons. At the 352nd Fighter Group's base, the pilots were already moving before the call came. The sky outside their tents was a milky grey, the horizon smeared with the smoke of burning towns. Major John Meyer, commanding officer of the unit, buckled his harness and pulled the canopy of his P-51 PT-2 shut. His last words before takeoff were clipped and calm. "Gentlemen, it's going to be one of those days." The first wave of German fighters appeared just after 1100 hours. They came in from the east in perfect formation, sunlight flashing off their canopies. At first glance, it seemed almost orderly until they opened fire. The crack of cannons echoed across the airfields as the Luftwaffe struck low, strafing runways and hangars. The first explosions tore through fuel trucks and parked aircraft. Flames rolled down the flight lines, turning the snow black. For the Allied pilots still on the ground, it was a nightmare made real. Some managed to lift off under fire, weaving between columns of smoke as tracer rounds cut the air around them. Others never left the ground. Within minutes, chaos reigned. The Luftwaffe's plan was working, at least for the moment. Above the battlefield, the sky turned into a living tapestry of contrails and flame. American P-47s from the 366th Group scrambled to intercept, roaring up through the haze in tight clusters. They met the German formations head-on, guns blazing. The collisions of sound and motion defied imagination. One instant of quiet followed by a hurricane of violence. Captain Harold "Mac" Ransom led one of the first intercept flights. He broke through the cloud layer at 15,000 feet and found himself surrounded by enemy aircraft. "They came at us like a black tide," he would recall later. You could see their tracer fire before you could even see their wings. He rolled his Thunderbolt into a dive, lining up a shot on a Focke-Wulf streaking toward an American airfield below. The burst caught the German fighter squarely on its fuselage, sending it spinning in flames through the overcast. Elsewhere, Mustangs from the 352nd engaged a mixed group of Messerschmitts and jet fighters above the Meuse River. The Me-262s were fast, faster than anything the Americans had faced before. Their twin engines left ghostly trails across the sky as they darted through the formations, unleashing cannon fire before vanishing into the haze. Yet their fuel endurance was short, and Allied pilots quickly learned to exploit it. By forcing the jets into hard turns and long climbs, they drained their tanks, trapping them before they could reach home. On the ground, the battle unfolded in layers. Smoke and fire blanketed the Allied airfields, but even amidst the destruction, ground crews kept working. Mechanics pulled damaged planes off the runways, cleared debris, and rearmed fighters as soon as they landed. In some places, pilots reloaded and refueled by hand, shoving ammunition belts into wings before climbing back into the cockpit. By early afternoon, the advantage began to shift. The Luftwaffe's initial attack had achieved surprise, but coordination was collapsing. Fuel shortages forced many pilots to break off early. Others, inexperienced and flying unfamiliar aircraft, lost formation in the haze. What had begun as a synchronized strike now fragmented into isolated dogfights spread across hundreds of miles. The Americans seized the moment. Fighter groups from across Belgium and northern France converged, swarming the retreating enemy formations. Above the fields near Liège, the largest dogfight of the day erupted. Over 200 aircraft twisted and dove through one another, vapor trails spiraling in the sun. P-51s and P-47s streaked past each other in tight turns, their gunfire flashing like lightning. The air smelled of cordite and burning fuel. Major Meyer led his Mustangs through the heart of it. They came straight through us, he later wrote, and for a second, the whole sky turned silver and red. He pulled his aircraft into a high loop, rolling over the top and diving into the tail of a 109, trying to escape. The burst from his 6 guns shredded the fighter's wing, sending it tumbling into the haze. The explosion lit the clouds from below, a brief flare swallowed by the mist. Below, near Asch Airfield, a group of Focke-Wulfs broke formation and dove to attack the returning Allied planes. The defenders were ready. 2 squadrons of Thunderbolts rose from the tree line, cutting them off at low altitude. The ensuing melee was brutal and swift. Tracers stitched the air as both sides tore through the sky, barely 100 feet above the ground. Snow erupted in geysers where mist rounds struck. One German pilot tried to pull out of a dive too late. His aircraft disintegrated on impact, scattering pieces across the forest. By mid-afternoon, the last of the German formations began to retreat eastward. Smoke columns marked their path, trailing from aircraft crippled in the fighting. For the Allies, the cost was steep. Hundreds of aircraft damaged or destroyed, many of them still on the ground from the initial raids. Yet the Luftwaffe's losses were catastrophic. Entire squadrons had been wiped out in a single day. When the skies finally quieted, the survivors on both sides flew home through a twilight streaked with ash. The radio chatter dwindled to static. Over the Rhine, wreckage drifted down like falling stars, silent against the fading light. At dusk, Major Meyer landed at Asch, his plane's fuselage riddled with holes. He climbed from the cockpit and stood for a long time beside it, watching the fires still burning at the far end of the airfield. Around him, mechanics moved through the wreckage in silence, stepping around the craters and the bodies of men who had been fueling planes only hours earlier. Later that night, Allied intelligence compiled the reports. More than 300 German aircraft lost, nearly the entire operational strength of the Western Luftwaffe. The Americans and British had lost around 200, most of them destroyed on the ground. It was a bloody stalemate in numbers, but the strategic reality was clear. Germany had thrown its last fistful of strength into the sky, and the blow had missed. The battle became known as the Luftwaffe's last charge, a phrase whispered with a mixture of awe and pity by the men who had survived it. The German Air Force had proven it still had courage, but courage no longer equaled victory. As the fires burned into the night, Allied pilots stood along the runways, their faces lit by the glow. They knew what this meant. The enemy's last real air offensive was over. The next time they crossed the Rhine, there would be no challenge waiting in the clouds. The war in the air was entering its final act. The final days of December 1944 saw the skies above the Ardennes turn into a crucible. The Luftwaffe's desperate assault had been repelled, its squadrons scattered across the Rhine, yet the embers of battle still burned fiercely. For the Allies, this was the moment to crush what remained. Every airfield hummed with a feverish energy. Pilots refueled, gunners rearmed, and commanders studied reconnaissance photos that showed retreating German columns crawling east through the forests. The mission now was simple: deny the enemy rest, deny them shelter, erase them from the air and the earth below. At Florennes, the morning briefing was delivered under a sky that flickered red from the fires still smouldering in the east. Colonel Robert Bud Meyer stood over a map marked with grease pencil lines running from Liège to Bitburg. The targets were clear: bridges, convoys, and fuel depots, every artery still feeding the Wehrmacht's offensive. He pointed to a winding stretch of road near the town of Houffalize. "This is where they're falling back. This is where we'll strike first." Around him, the room was silent but alive with tension. The men of the 365th Fighter Group had flown nearly every day since the weather had cleared, and fatigue clung to their faces, yet each man knew this was the decisive blow. Outside, engines coughed to life, thick smoke curling into the frozen air. The Thunderbolts were armed with a mix of bombs and rockets, 4 under each wing, heavy enough to slow takeoff. Snow and slush sprayed behind the wheels as the first aircraft clawed into the air. The roar echoed off the hangars, rolling across the fields like distant thunder. Within minutes, the sky above the base was alive with streaks of silver climbing toward the horizon. The flight crossed into German-held territory at low altitude. Below, the Ardennes looked ravaged and skeletal. Blackened forests, burned-out villages, rivers choked with wreckage. Smoke hung in the air like a ghost, turning the landscape into an endless battlefield. Over the radio, the chatter was sparse, each pilot focused on the rhythmic hum of the engine and the glint of sunlight on snow. As they neared Houffalize, the first enemy fire reached up to meet them. Streams of tracer rounds rose from the tree line, followed by the thunderous bursts of flak. The sky erupted in orange blossoms, each explosion shaking the formation. Colonel Meyer called out through the static, "Spread out and stay low. Hit the bridges first." The Thunderbolts dove through the haze, their bombs whistling downward in long arcs. The first strikes hit the river crossings, erupting into fountains of water and stone. The bridges disintegrated in seconds, collapsing into the icy currents below. Smoke and debris engulfed the valley, and within that storm of fire, the second wave rolled in, targeting the convoy trapped on the far side. Trucks ignited like matchsticks. Fuel tankers exploded into roaring columns of flame that painted the clouds above a deep, hellish red. From a few thousand feet above, the pilots could see the full scale of the devastation. The narrow roads were gridlocked with burning vehicles. Soldiers scattered into the woods, their retreat dissolving into chaos. The Thunderbolts circled and came in again, their 8 machine guns tearing through the wreckage, turning the entire valley into an inferno. To the east, another battle unfolded. A mixed formation of P-51 Mustangs from the 352nd and 361st Fighter Groups intercepted a cluster of retreating Luftwaffe fighters over the Schnee-Eifel Hills. The Germans were attempting to cover their ground forces' withdrawal, but their formation was thin, tired, outnumbered, and running on fumes. The clash began at 12,000 feet, sunlight reflecting off frost-coated wings as the two sides met in a head-on pass. The first exchange was over in seconds. Captain Ed Anderson, flying his Mustang Hell's Angel, spotted 2 Fokker Wolves breaking for the cloud layer and dove after them. The air screamed against his canopy as he pushed the throttle forward, the altimeter spinning down. His guns flared, the tracers vanishing into the haze. One of the German fighters caught fire instantly, the other rolling hard to escape. Anderson stayed on its tail through the twisting valleys, closing the distance until his rounds struck the engine cowling. The explosion was brief and violent, a flash swallowed by the snow. Elsewhere, the fight turned into a swarm of dueling contrails. German and American aircraft spiraled through each other's paths, engines roaring, wings carving white scars across the blue. For the men inside those cockpits, the world had narrowed to seconds and instincts. Every move was about survival, each burst of gunfire, each turn through the cloud. Below, the ground war continued to unravel. The Thunderbolt groups returned for another series of strikes, sweeping from St. Vith to Clairvaux. The valleys thundered with explosions. The pilots flew through smoke so thick it left a bitter taste in their mouths, the residue of fuel and fire hanging in the air. From the radio came fragments of communication, call signs, warnings, the dull crack of static, punctuated by brief exclamations of triumph or grief. At 1400 hours, the Luftwaffe launched one final attempt to challenge the Allied air armada. A group of Messerschmitt 109s, likely from JG-27, rose from the east in small, desperate clusters. They were intercepted almost immediately. The Americans had numerical superiority, radar coordination, and fuel to spare. The Germans had none of those advantages, only courage and resolve. For 10 minutes, the sky over the Ardennes became a swirling cauldron. Planes crossed so closely that pilots could see the frost on their opponents' wings. One Mustang and one Messerschmitt collided mid-turn, their wrecks tumbling together in flames. The survivors continued to fight until ammunition ran dry. By the time the engagement ended, the Luftwaffe's final defense of the Ardennes had disintegrated. The few German aircraft that escaped turned east toward the Rhine, pursued by Allied fighters until the horizon blurred. The airspace above the battlefield now belonged entirely to the Allies. Late that afternoon, the returning pilots flew westward through a landscape still burning. Smoke curled upward from forests and towns, glowing faintly as the sun dipped behind the clouds. The snow, once pristine, was streaked black with ash. The Ardennes looked like the aftermath of some ancient cataclysm, its silence broken only by the distant rumble of collapsing bridges and exploding fuel. When the Thunderbolts landed back at Florennes, the airfield was nearly silent. Mechanics worked quickly, eyes squinting against the smoke drifting from the horizon. The pilots climbed out of their cockpits one by one, exhausted, their faces streaked with soot. The mission had succeeded, German movement in the sector had been obliterated, but the cost was visible in every man's expression. War in the air left no clean victories, only survival measured in hours. That night, the horizon to the east pulsed with light as the fires continued to burn. Pilots gathered outside the operations tent, standing in silence beneath a dark sky, streaked with the faint trails of their own aircraft. The scent of fuel and cordite lingered in their clothes, and behind their fatigue was the quiet knowledge that the battle for control of the air was now over. The Ardennes offensive, once Hitler's great gamble, was collapsing. The German armies had lost their shield. The Luftwaffe had spent its strength in the December skies and had nothing left to give. The road to the Rhine lay open. In the distance, faint flashes marked the retreating front. The world was changing again, and those who had ruled the sky knew what awaited them next. The long pursuit into Germany itself, where the final fires of the Reich would burn out at last. By the first dawn of the new year, the Ardennes lay quiet beneath a frozen veil. The roar of engines that had once torn through the clouds was gone. The endless convoys, the flashing muzzle bursts, the dueling contrails, all had faded into memory. In their place remained a landscape wounded beyond recognition. Forests that had stood for centuries were now burned to blackened stumps. The air still carried the metallic tang of gunpowder and oil, mingled with the heavy stillness that comes only after great violence. The Allied airfields across Belgium woke to the kind of morning pilots dreaded most, peaceful, still, and heavy with the ghosts of those who would never return. Frost clung to the canopies of the grounded fighters, the engines silent for the first time in weeks. The men who had flown through hell just days earlier moved slowly now, their bodies carrying the weight of exhaustion and memory. At Florennes, a thin mist hung over the runway. The snow was scorched black in places where returning aircraft had landed on fire. Mechanics walked the flight line in near silence, brushing ice from bullet holes that peppered the fuselages of the Thunderbolts and Mustangs. Every dent and scar told a story, each one earned in the skies above Bastogne, St. Vith, and the frozen valleys beyond. Inside the operations tent, the air was still thick with the smell of fuel and cigarette smoke. Colonel Robert Meyer stood over a map dotted with grease pencil circles. The names, Houffalize, Clairvaux, St. Vith, had become synonymous with sacrifice. Reports from reconnaissance flights poured in through the radio. No sign of organized Luftwaffe formations east of the Rhine. The voice from command was flat and tired as it came through the static. The enemy air force has ceased major operations. It was the sentence every man in that tent had been waiting to hear, yet the mood remained subdued. Victory, when it finally arrived, felt more like the end of breath than a shout of triumph. The men had seen too much sky on fire to mistake quiet for glory. Out in the snow beyond the airfield, a small convoy of trucks made its way toward a line of wrecked aircraft that had been dragged to the perimeter. The wrecks were charred husks, their wings crumpled, their insignias burned away. Ground crews worked in silence to recover what could be salvaged: guns, radios, even fragments of metal for reuse. The rest would be left where they had fallen, markers of the battle's cost. At midday, a lone Mustang lifted off from the strip, circling once before setting a course east. It was an observation patrol, tasked with confirming what everyone already knew, that the Luftwaffe's final charge had ended in ruin. The pilot, Captain Ed Anderson, flew low over the valleys he had fought above days earlier. From the air, the devastation seemed infinite. The Ardennes was no longer a forest, it was a graveyard. Columns of smoke still drifted from the places where convoys had burned. Frozen rivers were littered with the twisted remains of bridges. Here and there, the glint of sunlight off metal marked the resting place of downed aircraft. Some German, some American, their wings jutting from the snow like broken monuments. He climbed higher, tracing the Meuse River toward the east. The sky, once filled with vapor trails, was empty. Only the soft hum of his engine filled the cockpit. For the first time in months, the horizon stretched clear and still. When he crossed into German territory, the ground below appeared lifeless. Airfields abandoned, hangars shattered, runways cratered from bomb strikes. Whatever was left of the Luftwaffe had retreated beyond sight, scattered across the heartland with neither fuel nor hope to rise again. Anderson turned back toward Belgium as the sun began to sink. From his altitude, the glow of sunset bled across the snowfields, painting the world in crimson and gold. It was a beauty born from destruction, the kind of sight that burned itself into memory. He switched frequencies, reporting his findings in a steady voice. No movement. The skies are ours. Back at base, word spread quickly. Pilots and ground crews gathered around radios as the confirmation came through from Allied High Command. Air superiority was absolute. The German Air Force had been broken beyond recovery. The last remnants of its power were scattered, its once feared wings grounded forever. The news reached Bastogne by nightfall. Among the battered divisions who had held that town against impossible odds, cheers echoed through the ruined streets. For those men, the droning engines overhead had always meant hope. Now, hearing of the Luftwaffe's collapse, they knew the worst was over. Supply drops arrived unhindered. The siege was lifted. The shadow that had hung over them for weeks finally dissolved into the winter night. Yet even in victory, the air war left its scars. Over the next days, rescue teams moved through the forests, searching for the remains of downed aircraft. They found parachutes frozen in trees, wrecks half buried in snow, and footprints that vanished into the dark. Some pilots had survived the crash only to freeze where they fell. Others were found sitting beside their ruined machines, as if waiting for rescue that never came. At one recovery site near Saint-Vith, a small group of soldiers came across a Thunderbolt lying upside down in a shallow ravine. The wings were torn away, the tail bent upward like a twisted cross. Inside the shattered cockpit, the pilot's jacket was still zipped, his gloved hands resting on the throttle. The rescuers stood in silence for a moment, then gently removed his identification tags before covering him with a tarp. It was an unspoken ritual now, an act of respect repeated countless times across the front. In the mess tents that evening, conversation drifted to the same topic, the strange quiet. Pilots spoke of how unsettling it felt to take off and see no black specks rising from the east, no contrails threading through the clouds. After years of hunting and being hunted, the emptiness felt unnatural. The sky, once an enemy's domain, now seemed too wide, too quiet, too still. As the new year approached, the men of the Allied air forces reflected on what they had witnessed. From Normandy to the Ardennes, the skies had carried the weight of the war's fiercest battles. They had outlasted the storm, but the cost had been measured in names written on chalkboards each morning and erased each night. Every squadron had its absences, every victory shadowed by loss. On January the 2nd, the weather cleared once again. Flights resumed, though the missions now felt different. No longer about survival, but about closing the book. Reconnaissance runs swept across Germany, photographing the ruins of cities and airfields. The reports confirmed what the pilots already sensed. The Luftwaffe, once the pride of the Reich, was finished. That afternoon, a few pilots gathered outside the briefing tent to watch the sun set. It dipped behind the horizon in a blaze of red, turning the frost to gold for a fleeting moment. No one spoke. They just watched as the last light faded, their breath forming pale clouds in the cold air. Somewhere beyond that horizon, the war was still raging, but for them, the great duel of the skies had reached its end. In the months that followed, many would carry the memories of these skies for the rest of their lives. The blinding flash of flak, the roar of engines, the endless expanse of white below. Yet on that evening, as darkness fell over the Ardennes, one truth remained clear to every man who had flown through the fire. Air superiority had been won at a price that would never be forgotten. The wind whispered across the empty runways, carrying with it the faint scent of smoke and oil. Beyond the trees, the last of the fires flickered out, leaving only the quiet hum of generators and the soft creak of metal cooling in the cold. The war in the air had fallen silent. The hunters had returned home. The Ardennes slept beneath a thin veil of snow, and the sky, once alive with fury, was finally still.